In the summer of 1983, 11 boys walked into the Appalachian wilderness of West Virginia. Only 10 walked out. The 11th, a 14-year-old scout named Danny Weller, was never found. Not that week. Not that year. Not ever. What the survivors described afterward was so strange, so consistent across 10 separate testimonies given by 10 frightened boys who barely knew each other, that the county sheriff sealed the file for 11 years. When it was finally opened under a records request in 1994, 3 pages were missing. No one has ever explained why. The boys said they heard something in the trees that first night, circling just beyond the firelight, always staying exactly at the edge of what they could see. They said it never stepped into the light. Not once. Not in 3 days. They found an old cabin buried in ferns and rotted timber, a place that was not on any map the troop had been given. Inside, a journal, soft with mildew, filled with a stranger's handwriting, describing people who vanished from these same woods 100 years before. The final page carried 7 words that every surviving scout would repeat, word for the rest of their lives. If you hear it calling your name, don't answer. That night, Danny Weller disappeared without a sound. Another boy was found 6 miles from camp before sunrise, soaked to the knees, his boots gone, unable to say how he got there or where he had been for 9 missing hours. The official report called it exhaustion, confusion, bad terrain in the dark. The boys who lived through it have never accepted that explanation. Some of them are grandfathers now. Most still refuse to go camping, and every one of them, when asked what they saw moving between the trees that night, describes the exact same shadow. This is the story of what happened to Troop 217 in the Monongahela Wilderness, and of the thing the survivors still refuse to name. The Monongahela National Forest spreads across nearly 1 million acres of eastern West Virginia, a country of steep ridgelines, black spruce bogs, and hollows so deep that sunlight never fully reaches the forest floor, even at noon. In the early 1980s, most of it remained exactly as it had been for 200 years, unmapped in any meaningful sense, threaded only by logging roads that had been cut and abandoned twice over. Locals called the deepest part of it Widow Hollow, though no map ever printed that name. The story passed down was that a mining settlement had once stood there, built sometime around 1880 by a coal company that pulled out its equipment within a decade and never came back. Nobody in town could say exactly why. The company records, when they existed at all, referred only to unprofitable yield and unsuitable conditions for continued operation. Older residents used a different word. They called it cursed ground, and they said it the way people say something they only half believe and fully fear. By 1983, Widow Hollow had not seen a permanent resident in over 60 years. The cabins that remained were folded into the hillside under decades of leaf litter, their roofs collapsed, their chimneys standing alone like broken teeth. Hunters avoided the area. Even the Forest Service maps left a blank patch where the old settlement had stood, marked only with the word abandoned in small gray print. Geologists who later studied the area for unrelated survey work noted something else about Widow Hollow, something that rarely made it into any official document, but that longtime residents brought up whenever the subject arose. Sound behaves strangely in that particular fold of the mountains. The hollow sits at the bottom of 3 converging ridgelines, and the acoustics created by that shape can carry a whisper for what feels like half a mile, while swallowing a shout entirely within a few hundred feet. Hunters who had spent decades in these woods described calling out to a partner standing in plain sight, only to receive no answer at all, and then hearing, minutes later, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Some called this a simple trick of the terrain. Others were not so certain, and preferred, whenever possible, to avoid the hollow after 4 in the afternoon, when the light began to fail and the shadows in that basin grew long before they grew anywhere else in the forest. It was into this blank patch that Troop 217 was scheduled to hike, though none of the adults organizing the trip realized exactly how close their planned route would bring them to it. Troop 217 was based out of a small town called Ashford Creek, population just under 3,000, the kind of place with one traffic light, one diner, and a Methodist church that still rang its bell by hand on Sunday mornings. The troop had existed for 18 years, and its summer wilderness trip was something of a rite of passage for the boys of Ashford Creek. An annual 3-day hike through the national forest meant to earn badges and, more quietly, to mark the boundary between childhood and something closer to manhood. The summer of 1983 had been unusually dry. The creeks were running low, the underbrush was tinder-ready, and the Forest Service had issued a mild fire advisory that the scoutmaster, a war veteran named Harold Pruitt, had noted and dismissed as routine. Pruitt had led this same trip for 9 consecutive years. He knew these mountains, or believed he did, and he had never once lost a boy. That summer, he would lose one forever, and would spend the rest of his life trying to explain how. Harold Pruitt was 51 years old in 1983, a former Army sergeant who had served 2 tours before returning home to Ashford Creek to work at the local lumber mill. He ran the troop with the same discipline he had carried out of the service, a man who believed fear was simply a problem to be organized against, a checklist item like water purification or map reading. His scouts respected him. Some of them, in later years, would say they had also been a little afraid of him, though not nearly as afraid as they would become of something else entirely. Danny Weller was 14, the youngest of 3 brothers, quiet in the particular way of boys who have learned to disappear inside a loud household. He had joined the troop reluctantly at his father's insistence and had spent most of the trip so far hanging near the back of the line, keeping close to a boy named Curtis Hale, the closest thing he had to a friend in the troop. Curtis Hale was 15, sharp-tongued, the kind of scout who filled silences with jokes because silence made him uneasy. It was Curtis who, decades later, would give the most detailed account of what happened, speaking to a journalist in 2019, only after his own son turned 14, the same age Danny had been. There was also Tommy Briggs, 17, the oldest boy on the trip, and an assistant patrol leader, steady and well-liked, the boy other scouts looked to when Pruitt was occupied elsewhere. And there was a younger boy, Ricky Voss, 12 years old, on his very first overnight trip, small for his age, terrified of the dark in a way the older boys teased him for gently. Right up until the night, none of them were teasing anymore. 11 boys in total, along with Pruitt and 1 parent volunteer, a quiet man named Walt Kessler, who worked at the feed store and had come along mostly because his own son was on the trip. Walt's boy, a shy 11-year-old named Jimmy Kessler, rarely left his father's side during the hike, and it was later noted by more than one investigator that this instinct, which the other boys had gently teased him for, may well have kept him safer than anyone else on that mountain. The remaining scouts, boys named Denny Ostrander, Fred Callahan, Bobby Truitt, and Sam Delgado, filled out the roster, each with his own reason for being there, his own small rivalries and friendships, the ordinary texture of any group of boys thrown together for a weekend in the woods. None of them had met anything before that weekend that the world had not already prepared them for. All of them would leave the mountain changed in ways their families struggled to name for years afterward. 12 people walked into the Monongahela forest on a Friday morning in July of 1983. 11 walked out on Sunday afternoon. The first day passed the way every previous year's trip had passed. The boys hiked 8 miles along a marked trail, made camp beside a shallow creek, cooked over an open fire, and told the kinds of stories boys tell when the sun goes down and the woods turn from green to black around them. Pruitt allowed 1 campfire tale each night a tradition, and that first night, it was Curtis who told a half-remembered story about a hitchhiking ghost, the kind of harmless legend passed between scout troops for generations. Nobody thought much of the first sound they heard, sometime after 10 o'clock, when the fire had burned down to embers. It was a snapping branch, distant, somewhere past the tree line. Pruitt said, "Deer," and the boys settled back into their bags, and the matter would have ended there if the sound had not come again, 20 minutes later. Closer, and again after that. Closer still. Always circling, never approaching, always stopping at some invisible line just beyond where the firelight gave out. Ricky Voss was the first to say something felt wrong. He said it quietly to Curtis, who told him to go to sleep, and Curtis would later admit he had felt it too. A specific and unfamiliar sensation of being watched by something that understood exactly how far the light reached and exactly how to stay outside of it. In the morning, before anyone had said a word about the night before, Tommy Briggs walked to the creek to refill canteens and called the rest of the boys over. Circling the camp in the soft mud along the water were tracks, not deer tracks, which every boy in that troop could identify blind, not bear, which Pruitt examined personally and ruled out within minutes. The tracks were long, narrow, oddly spaced, three-toed impressions pressed deep into mud that should not have held a print that clear unless considerable weight had been behind it. Pruitt photographed them with his own camera, a detail that matters because that roll of film was later developed, and every frame containing the tracks came back blank, overexposed in a way the drugstore technician could not explain, given that the surrounding frames on the same roll were perfectly clear. Pruitt told the boys it was likely a large dog, feral, common enough in these hills. Most of the older boys accepted this because they wanted to. Ricky Voss did not, and he spent the second day of hiking close enough to Walt Kessler that the grown man eventually put a hand on the boy's shoulder without being asked. There was one more detail from that first morning that few of the boys mentioned at the time, and that only came out years later in Curtis Hale's retelling. The birds had gone silent, not gradually, the way birdsong naturally fades as hikers approach and startle wildlife into stillness, but all at once, the way Curtis later described it, like someone flipping a switch. He remembered noticing the quiet before he noticed the tracks, a heavy, pressing silence that made the ordinary sounds of their own footsteps and voices feel suddenly too loud, too exposed, as though the forest itself were listening back. The planned route for day 2 ran along a marked logging trail that, according to Pruitt's map, would loop them back toward the trailhead by Sunday morning. But the map was 9 years old, and a washout from a spring flood had erased nearly half a mile of the trail, forcing the troop to cut cross-country through unmarked forest to rejoin the path further along. It was in that unmarked stretch, descending into a hollow thick with rhododendron and old-growth hemlock, that Tommy Briggs spotted something through the trees that did not belong. A structure, or what remained of one. They found it at the bottom of the hollow, a cluster of 5 or 6 collapsed cabins, swallowed almost completely by the forest, roofs long since caved in, walls furred with moss, an entire settlement erased so thoroughly that nothing but persistent human curiosity would ever have found it again. Pruitt, against his own better instinct, allowed a short break to explore, reasoning that scouts should see firsthand how quickly the wilderness reclaims what people abandon. It was Danny Weller who found the journal. Inside the most intact of the cabins, beneath a collapsed section of roof that had somehow left one corner untouched by 60 years of weather, sat an iron stove, and beside it, wrapped in what remained of an oilcloth, a leather-bound book. The pages were swollen and soft, the ink faded to brown, but much of it remained legible, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand that identified its author only by the initials E.M. The journal described a settlement of coal miners and their families, numbering perhaps 60 people at its height, established around 1879. It described, in increasingly fragmented entries, a series of disappearances beginning in the settlement's third winter. Livestock first, then a child, then, over the following 2 years, 4 more people, 3 adults, and another child, each vanishing without any trace, always at night, always without a sound loud enough to wake a household. The author wrote of whistling heard in the trees after dark, a sound the miners at first assumed was one of their own, until every man in the settlement had been accounted for around the fire, while the whistling continued outside. The entries grew shorter and more erratic as the journal continued, several pages torn out entirely, and the final legible page contained only a single line, written larger and pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through it. If you hear it calling your name, don't answer. One entry, dated only as the second week of December, described the author standing on his own porch at dusk and hearing his late wife's voice calling from the tree line, clear as anything, using a nickname that no living person besides himself was supposed to know. He wrote that he had taken 2 steps toward the sound before catching himself, and that he had then bolted his door and refused to open it again until well past sunrise, listening the entire night to the same voice calling patiently, without anger, without urgency, simply calling again and again, as though it had all the time in the world. Curtis read it aloud to the gathered boys, intending it as a joke, a campfire story handed to them by fate itself. Nobody laughed. Pruitt took the journal, tucked it into his pack, and ordered the troop to move on and make camp before dark. He would later tell investigators that he regretted, more than anything else in his life, not simply turning the troop around and hiking straight back out of the forest that afternoon. They made camp that evening barely a quarter-mile from the ruined settlement, in a small clearing beside a creek that Pruitt judged defensible and dry. It was the last decision he would make with full confidence for the remainder of the trip. The whistling began just after full dark. Every surviving scout describes it slightly differently, and yet every description shares the same essential quality. It was not a bird. Every boy raised in these hills could identify a whip-poor-will or a screech owl without thinking twice, and every one of them insists, even now, that what they heard bore no resemblance to any bird call known in that forest. It was closer to a human whistle, 3 notes repeated, rising, then falling, and it came from a different direction almost every time it repeated, as though whatever produced it was moving in a wide, patient circle around the camp. Pruitt ordered the fire built higher and told the boys the sound was almost certainly a screech owl, a claim that even Tommy Briggs, the most level-headed of the older boys, later said he didn't believe even as Pruitt said it. Around midnight, the whistling stopped. What replaced it was worse. A voice, thin and distant, carried on the wind through the trees, calling a name. Several boys swear the name it called was Danny's. Danny Weller himself never spoke publicly about that night, not once in the 4 decades that followed. And so what he heard, if he heard his own name called from the darkness, is something we will likely never know for certain. Jimmy Kessler, the youngest boy on the trip besides Ricky Voss, later told his father that he had lain awake through most of that middle stretch of night, too frightened to sleep, listening to the voice grow nearer and then farther and then nearer again, and that at one point it had stopped calling a name altogether and had simply hummed, low and tuneless, directly, he was certain, from just behind the log where he and his father lay. Walt Kessler, when asked about this by investigators, confirmed that his son had gripped his arm hard enough to leave marks, and that he himself had heard something in that same window of time, though he was never able to describe it as anything more specific than a presence, a sense of density in the dark air near the tent, that had no earthly source he could identify. What is certain is that sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, Danny Weller left his sleeping bag, and he did not come back. Curtis Hale woke first. He would tell the journalist 36 years later that he woke not to a sound, but to an absence of one. The specific and unsettling stillness of a body no longer beside him in the tent. Danny's sleeping bag lay open, empty, undisturbed, as though he had simply stood up and walked out without hurry, without struggle, without a single cry that anyone in that camp of 11 other people had heard. Pruitt organized a search within minutes, splitting the boys into pairs, keeping them within calling distance of one another and of the fire, a decision born of military training that likely prevented a second disappearance that night. They searched the immediate clearing, the creek bank, the tree line in both directions. They called Danny's name until their voices went hoarse. The forest gave back nothing. It was Ricky Voss, the youngest boy, who first pointed out what several others had already noticed, but had not yet said aloud. The whistling and the calling voice had stopped the moment the search began, and had not returned since, as though whatever produced them had gotten precisely what it wanted, and no longer needed to call. At some point past 3 in the morning, with Danny still missing, a second crisis unfolded. A boy named Peter Salas, 13 years old, wandered away from his search partner in the confusion near the tree line and could not be found for several minutes of frantic calling. He was located shortly afterward, disoriented, soaked to the knees in creek water, though the creek near camp ran barely ankle deep, and entirely unable to explain how he had become separated or where exactly he had been standing when his partner lost sight of him. Peter Salas was not found 6 miles away, as some retellings of this story claim, but the confusion and creek water on his boots, when no creek nearby could account for it, remained unexplained for the rest of his life. He gave conflicting timelines to investigators, to his own parents, and eventually, once, briefly, to a reporter in the late 90s, before refusing ever to discuss the trip again. Tommy Briggs, in the statement he gave 3 days later, described one detail he never repeated publicly again after that first interview. He said that in the minutes before the search began, while the camp was still frozen in that first shock of realizing Danny was gone, he thought he heard, very faintly, from somewhere down toward the ruined settlement, a sound that was almost laughter. Not cruel laughter, he was careful to specify to the investigator taking his statement. Something closer to satisfaction, the sound of something that had gotten exactly what it came for and felt no particular hurry about anything else. Pruitt himself, hardened as he was by 2 tours overseas, would later tell his own son that the 11 days following that night were the only period in his adult life he could not bring himself to describe in full, not out of grief alone, though the grief was real and lasting, but because he no longer trusted his own account of what he had seen and heard in those woods well enough to put it into words. He had led men through combat. He had never, before or since, felt the specific helplessness of standing at the edge of a firelight, calling a child's name into a darkness that seemed, impossibly, to be listening. Danny Weller was never found that night, nor the following day, nor in the extended search that followed over the coming week. By dawn, Walt Kessler had hiked out alone to reach a ranger station and summon help, arriving badly dehydrated and shaking so severely that the responding officers initially assumed he himself had been the missing party. Search and rescue teams reached the campsite by early afternoon, and a full-scale search of the surrounding forest, including the ruined settlement in the hollow below, began within hours. The search lasted 11 days. It involved county sheriffs, forest rangers, volunteer trackers, and at one point, 2 bloodhounds brought in from a neighboring county. Dogs that, according to their handler's own report, refused to approach within 50 yards of the collapsed cabins and could not be coaxed forward by any method attempted. One of the handlers, interviewed decades later for a regional newspaper retrospective, said he had worked search dogs for over 20 years and had never once seen an animal behave that way, planting its feet, whining low in its throat, refusing every command until it was walked well clear of the hollow and allowed to work elsewhere. No trace of Danny Weller was ever recovered, not a boot print past the initial search radius, not a scrap of clothing, not in the entire 11-day search, a single physical indication that a 14-year-old boy had ever walked in that direction at all. Helicopter flyovers using infrared equipment, borrowed from a National Guard unit 2 counties over, turned up nothing across the surrounding 6 square miles, a result the pilot himself found strange enough to mention unprompted in his own written report, noting that even a deer carcass should have registered a heat signature somewhere in that range, and that the total absence of any reading at all felt, in his own words, wrong in a way he could not properly explain to his commanding officer. The Forest Service's official incident report, filed some 6 weeks later, attributed the disappearance to disorientation in unfamiliar terrain, compounded by darkness and what the report called heightened anxiety among the group following the discovery of the abandoned settlement. It recommended no further action beyond a standing missing persons designation, and it made no mention of the journal, the tracks, the exposed and blank photograph frames, or the whistling that every surviving scout had by then independently described to investigators in separate interviews. Curtis Hale's own statement, given 3 days after the search began, ran to 11 handwritten pages. When the file was reopened under records request in 1994, only 8 of those pages remained in the folder. The sheriff's department at the time offered no explanation for the missing pages beyond the possibility of clerical error during a records transfer in the late 80s, an explanation that satisfied no one who had followed the case, least of all Curtis Hale himself, who obtained a photocopy of his original statement through his father, a local attorney, and confirmed that the 3 missing pages were the ones describing the voice calling Danny's name. What emerged, slowly, over the following decade, was not a single clean answer, but a pattern. One that connected Widow Hollow to a history far older and stranger than any single scout troop's misfortune. A local historian named Evelyn Marsh, working independently in the late 80s on a project documenting abandoned West Virginia mining communities, uncovered records confirming that the settlement in Widow Hollow, formerly named Cade's Fork on old company ledgers, had indeed lost 7 residents to unexplained disappearance between 1882 and 1884, a rate of loss so far outside normal frontier mortality that it prompted the mining company itself to abandon a still profitable seam rather than continue operations. Marsh's research further turned up 2 additional disappearances in the same general area in 1931, involving a pair of surveyors mapping timber boundaries, and a third in 1962, a solitary hunter whose truck was found parked at a trailhead with the keys still in the ignition and his rifle still loaded on the passenger seat. None of these cases were ever solved. None produced a body, and in each case, according to surviving witness accounts Marsh collected from elderly Ashford Creek residents before their own deaths, those closest to the missing reported the same detail in the days before the disappearance. A whistling in the trees after dark, a voice calling a name. The journal that Danny Weller carried out of that cabin and that Pruitt surrendered to investigators during the initial search was logged into county evidence storage in July of 1983 and was never returned to the scout troop or made available to researchers. When Evelyn Marsh formally requested access to it in 1991 for her historical project, the Evidence Department reported that the item could not be located in storage. It has never resurfaced. Marsh's research also turned up something else, a detail she included almost as a footnote in her original manuscript, but that later researchers found difficult to dismiss. In each of the recorded disappearances spanning over a century, from the original miners in the 1880s to the hunter in 1962, to Danny Weller himself. The missing person was always the youngest or most vulnerable member of their immediate group. A child, a small boy on his first hunting trip with an uncle, a young apprentice surveyor barely out of his teens. The pattern, if it was a pattern at all, and not simply the cruel arithmetic of coincidence repeated across enough decades to start resembling design, suggested something that selected carefully, that waited, that seemed to prefer whichever member of a group would be missed the longest before anyone thought to look. No official theory has ever accounted for what happened to Danny Weller, or to the 6 people before him, or the 3 after. The only common thread, offered not by any investigator, but by the survivors themselves, each independently, each reluctantly, across 4 decades of occasional and painful retelling, is a single shared image. A shadow, moving at the exact edge of the firelight, patient, unhurried, never once stepping into view. Troop 217 disbanded within 18 months of the incident. Harold Pruitt resigned from scouting entirely, spent the remaining years of his life working at the mill, and according to his son, never once camped outdoors again, not even in his own backyard. He died in 2001, and among his effects was found a single photograph, one frame from that ruined roll of film that had somehow, inexplicably, developed after all. It showed the tree line beyond the campsite, slightly out of focus, and at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by a hemlock trunk, what appears to be the outline of a tall, narrow figure, standing motionless, facing the camera. Curtis Hale went on to become a high school teacher in Ashford Creek. He married, raised 2 children, and for 36 years told almost no one about that weekend, until his own son turned 14 and asked innocently if he could go on a scout camping trip. Curtis said no, and when his son pressed him for a reason, Curtis found himself, for the first time, telling the whole story from beginning to end. Ricky Voss left West Virginia entirely at 18 and never returned, not even for his own parents' funerals, arranging instead for the services to be held without his physical presence, a decision his surviving family never fully understood, and Ricky himself has never explained. Danny Weller's family held a memorial service in 1984 without a body, without any legal declaration of death for a further 7 years, as required by state law for a missing person presumed dead. His mother kept his room unchanged until her own death in 2007. His father, in one of his only public statements on the matter, told a local newspaper in 1990, "We did not lose our son to these mountains. We lost him to something these mountains have always known about and never told us." Tommy Briggs went on to serve as a volunteer firefighter in a neighboring county for over 30 years, a career his family always connected, quietly and without ever discussing it directly, to a need he seemed to carry afterward to be the one who found people, who brought them home, who made sure no one else was ever left standing at the edge of a dark tree line, waiting for an answer that never came. He passed away in 2015. At his funeral, his daughter mentioned that he had kept, in a drawer in his workshop for his entire adult life, a single scrap of torn canvas that he told her, only once, had come from Danny Weller's pack, found snagged on a branch at the very edge of where the search dogs had refused to go any further. Peter Salas moved away from Ashford Creek entirely by his early 20s and built a quiet, private life in another state, declining every interview request that ever reached him, including, according to family members, at least one from a national television program in the early 2000s that offered a substantial fee simply for an on-camera conversation. He turned it down without explanation and asked never to be contacted again. Widow Hollow remains part of the Monongahela National Forest today, technically open to hikers, though the ruined settlement is no longer marked on any official trail map, and forest rangers, when asked directly, tend to discourage visitors from seeking it out, citing unstable structures and difficult terrain, an explanation that satisfies most people who ask, and satisfies almost no one who has actually read the file. Every few years, someone new stumbles across the old case, digs through the surviving records, and asks the same question that has never once been answered to anyone's satisfaction. What exactly happened to Troop 217 in the summer of 1983? The survivors, the ones still living, offer no theories anymore. Most of them are old men now. Grandfathers, retirees, men who built ordinary lives in the decades since that weekend, and who rarely, if ever, speak of it even to their own families. But ask any one of them, even now, even after 40 years, what they would do if they found themselves back in those woods after dark and heard a voice calling their name from somewhere among the trees, and every single one of them will give you the same answer without a moment of hesitation. They simply repeat the same warning, word for word, the one written on the final legible page of a journal that vanished from an evidence locker and has never been seen since. If you hear it calling your name in those woods after dark, don't answer. This is a work of fiction. All names, locations, events, and characters in this story are entirely invented for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.